Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Geyn. Today we're discussing psychedelic drugs and their potential therapeutic uses and how their medical potential butts up against Canada's legal and regulatory regime. Psychedelic drugs include psilocybin, ketamine, and MDMA. MDMA was largely known as a dance or party drug for raves because of its mood enhancing properties, but its recreational use led it to being placed on the Schedule 3 of the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act in Canada. But the drug has interesting possible therapeutic uses. In 2019, the US FDA granted a breakthrough therapy designation to MDMA, assisted psychotherapy, for the treatment of post traumatic stress disorder, as well as for psilocybin for the treatment of major depressive disorder. What is the status of these drugs in Canada, and how do we balance recreational abuse of this drug with research and therapeutic breakthroughs for incredibly difficult to treat mental illnesses? Here today to discuss this is Nick Kadysh, the CEO of PharmAla, a biotech company, and we're also joined by Gary Hess, a U.S. Marine veteran of 11 years who was hit by a truck filled with explosives while serving in Iraq. He went on to found the Veterans Alliance for Holistic Alternatives. Thank you both so much for joining me today. Gary, let me start with you. First of all, thank you for your service. Next, can you tell me about your story? What happened in your military service and what was life like after?
Yeah, so very quick, I grew up in a very conservative South, and if I even said the word psychedelics in my household, my father would be discipline me in a very harsh way. So I joined the service, both enlisted and as an officer. Served as an infantry officer during the heaviest levels of fighting in Iraq, and one of the culminating incidents was the day after Christmas in 2006. They drove a full-size triaxle dump truck loaded with C4 into the house we were occupying, and that was the beginning of the end of my service. And but what I didn't realize was that the toughest journey was yet to come. And so I turned my hands over to the Western model of medicine, and it was pharmaceuticals and surgeries and traditional talk therapies. And at the end of a decade, the best answer was taking my own life. And it eventually came to the point where I was out of options, and I'm here today because psychedelic assisted therapies have saved my life.
Well, I'm so happy to hear that you are here today, and I'm glad to hear that you are doing a lot better. How did you start your investigation into these alternative psychedelic drugs, these alternatives to traditional pharmaceuticals? What was your experience like with them?
Yeah, so for me, the intentional work um, started with cannabis. It was at the point where I was absolutely out of options, and because another Marine, one of my scout snipers that I served with, he ridded himself off of the pills, the opioids, utilizing cannabis. And so he brought it to me one day, and it was very difficult, even a very difficult conversation for me to have. But I was desperate. My family had broken down. I lost my business. My houses were in foreclosure. Right, life was crumbling, and so the intentional use of cannabis allowed me to manage the state of chronic stress. But it got to a point over the course of about 3 years where that was still being triggered, and I knew there were things that were still deep that I could not get to, and that's when I tried my first psychedelic assisted therapy experience, and it was psilocybin and bufo alvarius, and it gave me the rest of the answers that I was looking for. And I have since then committed my life to providing access to others in need who are also out of options. And so to date, I've sat with psilocybin, 5-MeO DMT, MDMA, ketamine, ibogaine, ayahuasca, wachuma, you name it, all with therapeutic intention to see how these medicines were working with my body and how it allowed me to work through the mechanics of that trauma and get to a point where my body could actually accept bliss and joy and happiness. And it's been a journey. It's been a journey, but I found the answers that I'm looking for, and now I spend the rest of my life advocating for others in need.
Well, what an incredible story. And having served the country, it's so important that the country is able to create a system that is going to work for you, and that wouldn't be possible without the advocacy that you're doing. I'm really interested to hear more about this. We've got to go to break though, so we will continue this when we come back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we are discussing the therapeutic uses of psychedelic drugs like MDMA and how it fits in with Canada's regulatory regime. Now, Nick, you are the CEO of a biotech company that works in this area with therapeutic MDMA. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how MDMA therapy works, how this drug is actually used in psychiatric treatment.
Yeah, for sure. So PharmAla, my company, is currently the largest supplier of commercial MDMA for medical use all across the world. We treat patients in a number of countries, and we're supplying about 25 clinical trials at really big institutions, Harvard, Yale, Johns Hopkins, all the big names. The way that MDMA works is through MDMA assisted therapy. So functionally, you work with your therapist, you prepare for a drug assisted therapy day. And then over the course of 3 months, you do 3 drug assisted therapy days where you come in, you take the drug. You don't get the drug to take home. It's not a once a day pill. You get it when you visit the therapist's office. You take it, and then you go through therapy while under the influence of the drug. I think with MDMA assisted therapy, it's fair to say it's not the drug that makes you better. It's actually the therapy that helps you. But the drug makes the therapy incredibly effective to the tune of 70% of patients who go through MDMA assisted therapy, and these are treatment resistant patients, right, who've already tried everything else and nothing else has worked. Within 3 months, 70% of them no longer have PTSD.
Wow, that's an incredible success rate for a drug like that. Um,
Yeah.
Gary, what can you tell me about your experience? Have you tried this particular type of therapy? I know that there are different mental conditions that these different psychedelic drugs are used to treat. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I have sat with MDMA, and Nick's absolutely right. It's it's the relational experience through that therapeutic alliance that is incredibly, it is enhanced and catalyzed by the MDMA. And here's why: is because that combat trauma, or trauma in general, is stored deeply within our body that our body will not access. And when we get there, we hit a place of fear, and that's converted to anger. And so when you talk to people who have experienced trauma and battling with trauma, anger becomes that default mode. You can't get to those hidden wounds because of the fear that presents itself. And so when you consume MDMA, it brings you into a state of bliss and joy and reduces the defense mechanisms so we can get to the root of the problem and work through it through an interactive approach with a clinical therapist or a coach. And it's an incredibly effective process.
Nick, can you tell me about any of the success stories that, other than Gary's, obviously, that you have seen working with MDMA with some of the patients and that you have your drug treat?
Yeah, of course. Obviously, without patient consent, I can't mention any patient names, but we've treated probably about 100 patients in Canada through the special access program here. In Australia, probably about 200 patients in the last year alone. Um, uh, the success rates mirror what we see in clinical trials, and I should say there's been already completed 2 phase 3 clinical trials looking at MDMA assisted therapy. Both had fantastic results, as you mentioned yourself, FDA breakthrough therapy status. Um, it is highly effective in the real world, in addition to the clinical trials, and we're seeing results very, very similar to what we saw in clinical trials. About 70% of patients, treatment-resistant patients, are basically fully in remission at the end of the therapy. And the great part is, it doesn't come back. I mean, unless you go through another traumatic incident, which can happen, of course. But if you just go on and live your life, you're functionally cured.
Wow. Um, I really want to get into the legal and regulatory regime. I don't think we'll have time to get through it before the next break, but maybe you can just start off by describing what that special access program is, Nick.
Yeah. So in Canada, these drugs are accessed through special access, which basically means a doctor applies to Health Canada to get the patient access to the drug. And then Health Canada does what they do, which unfortunately, in the Canadian context, lately means that they sit on the application for significant periods of time. Now, this doesn't have to be this way. There's lots of other mechanisms to control access to controlled substances without hurting the ability of doctors and patients to use these medications in an appropriate way.
Hmm. We've got to go to commercial break now, but when we come back, I want to talk about what some of those alternatives might be, what changes you might advocate for in Health Canada's system, and how our system compares to other countries, like the work Gary's doing in the United States. We'll be right back. Back to Canadian Justice, where we are discussing the therapeutic uses of psychedelic drugs like MDMA. Now, Nick, you are the CEO of a biotech company that works with MDMA for therapeutic uses. You were describing how Health Canada allows for this special access program so that doctors apply on a patient by patient basis, it sounds like, to get an exception to do this treatment with individual patients. You mentioned some problems with that system and that there might be alternatives or better ways of achieving this really breakthrough therapy for people with PTSD in particular. What ideas do you have that could improve the system and how it's operating as it stands?
Yeah, look, I think the ideal system is just to have these drugs as approved drugs. The problem is we have a regulatory system for the pharmaceutical world that's really based around patented novel pharmaceuticals. And MDMA, psilocybin, these are drugs that have been around for a very long time. They're not patentable. And so it's very, very hard to go out and say, spend $300 million on clinical trials and then and get something approved that will be basically put you in competition with a bunch of other competitors immediately because you have no patent protection. Although there are charities like the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies that have done that for MDMA. So they've raised $300 billion in charitable contributions and performed these clinical trials. Uh, you know, Outside of that, there are other options. So I would say the biggest problem with the Canadian approach is centering the federal bureaucracy in between doctors and patients. And it's not how the rest of the medical system works. A doctor doesn't check in with a bureaucrat in Ottawa prior to writing a prescription. They write the prescription. We rely on their medical knowledge and competence in order to do their jobs properly. And in Australia, which is another market we work in, that's exactly how it works. So rather than approving the individual patients in Australia, they approve psychiatrists, and the psychiatrists have the access. They can do the work as they see fit.
Gary, how does the system work in the United States? I mean, I know that you advocate for alternatives, holistic and different alternatives for veterans in particular. What do you know about the challenges accessing different psychedelic drugs for veterans with PTSD, whether it be MDMA or a different drug like ketamine, cannabis, or psilocybin?
Yeah, with psychedelic assisted therapies in general, access is pretty much non-existent, except through some of the clinical trials that are being approved, which are few and far between, given the suicide crisis that the veteran community is. We've lost 7,000 service members in combat operations over the last 2 decades. And that same period of time, we've lost close to 240,000 to suicide and overdose. Right, so there is a right to try activation, right to try act, which is similar to the expanded access program in Canada, but still it is very minimal access. There's no federal funding or VA integration, no clear regulatory guidance or support. There's legal and institutional hesitation. Access remains cost prohibited, and there are awareness and education gaps, and those are some of the centers of our focus for the Veterans Mental Health Leadership Coalition, is bringing this conversation to the lawmakers. But exactly as Nick said, right, the bureaucracy that gets in the way of progress here um, is painful to watch at the rate that we're losing these men and women, and so. we're doing what we can to minimize some of these barriers, and it's working with people like Nick and coming through a collaborative effort between Canada and the United States to discuss these barriers and find ways to overcome them.
Nick, do you think that the culture broadly it has shifted around the use of therapeutic drugs and their potential, or psychedelic drugs and their potential? Because I know that these were drugs that um, there's been a lot of villainization of them, and perhaps rightly so. There are some terrible cases where people who abused psychedelic drugs went on to commit crimes, for example. But do you think that the conversation is shifting towards this more medicalization approach and the potential these drugs have?
Yeah, look, there's all kinds of drugs in the medical system, which, if they are abused, are terrible. You know, opioids are a great example. If you're going into surgery, you're going to want some painkillers, right? And that's rightly so. All drugs have risks, but the ability to access these drugs for therapeutic use, it should not really be in question at this point. There's more clinical evidence behind some of these drugs than there is for widely available pharmaceuticals. And some of the drugs that are available now aren't actually, even indicated. Like, ketamine is not indicated for mental health disorders, but it's
Mhm.
being used for it.
We've got to go to commercial break now, but we will be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing psychedelic drugs and their potential therapeutic uses to treat different mental illnesses. Now, Nick, with respect to MDMA in particular, are there risks associated with long term use of the drug? Or is that sort of not even a concern in the way it's being used therapeutically? Because as you described the treatment protocol, a few sessions with a psychiatrist under supervision can actually resolve PTSD for good, and you wouldn't actually need to continue with long-term use.
Yeah. So first of all, you're exactly right. It's a very limited term protocol, so it's only 3 months. The patient only gets the drug when they go in for their therapy session. They take nothing home with them, so the risk of diversion is non-existent. And the other great thing about MDMA is it's not habit forming. It's not addictive. It actually is negatively reinforcing. So if you take it like 3 days in a row, by day three, you're not feeling anything. So it's actually incredibly safe as compared to a lot of the stuff that we see on the streets every day.
Uh, Greg, one of the things that's interesting is that MDMA, there still is a stigma associated with it due to its continued use as a recreational drug, in particular, its use in raves and for parties. So, how do we balance, this continued risk associated with recreational use with patient therapy, patient needs, regulatory decisions, and safety?
Yeah, there absolutely is risk with recreational use, but I think especially with the veteran community right now, where does the real risk lie? It's in doing nothing, right? We're seeing that the current model is failing us, and because of this stigma is present, even when you're talking about psilocybin, because these were drugs that were very present in the '60s and led to the Controlled Substances Act, but it's incredibly important to understand this perspective, and this is where the veteran storytelling and that lived experience comes into play to start passing this legislation. And it's not only veterans, 7 out of 10 Americans, Canadians experience trauma in their lifetime, but it's those with the lived experience that says, hey, I understand the recreational use and understand there are negative impacts, but this is the life I lived. Very similar life to yours, although you're making this decision about the law that governs our health care. This medication, this medicine, this therapeutic protocol helps me. It has absolutely saved my life, right? I am asking you to listen, right? And to have the leadership to make the decisions that are necessary so that the people who are suffering can gain access. This therapy works.
Gary, I'm so interested in how you have those conversations with other veterans because I imagine a lot of them had a similar upbringing to you, a conservative family who was raised, say no to drugs, and now you're trying to convince someone this drug could actually save your life when for their whole life it's been stigmatized. So how do you have that conversation?
You just meet them where they are, right? If they're suffering with that, they can understand why they're always angry, or whether they're depressed or anxious or continually hyper aroused or hyper vigilant, right? I can tell them my story and how it broke down my family and how it started breaking down my occupation and my professional life and every aspect of my life. And the truth is that I became disconnected from myself. And this is what happens when the mind and the body become disconnected because of that fear is our lives start breaking down. And if I can share an experience that resonates with the experience that they're going through, their ears are open because in most cases they've tried the other alternatives. They've been on pharmaceuticals for a very long time. They've been through the traditional talk therapies from a top-down approach that are ineffective. Right? This medicine allows you to go to the bottom and work your way back up to the top while you're interacting with a clinically trained professional to work through that story that has defined who we are, right? It's you meet them where they are, but you give them a very valid lived experience because they've lost a lot of trust in the system. And that's what's moving this legislation.
Nick, do you think stigma has played any role in the government's resistance to therapy? Just very briefly.
Yeah, I think the stigma is the only thing driving government intransigence on this,
Mhm.
and it's the only segment of the population that is still being driven by stigma because it's not driving patients or doctors anymore.
We are done. Thank you both so much for this fascinating conversation.
Thank you.
We've heard today about the therapeutic possibilities associated with psychedelic drugs like MDMA. Is the law flexible enough to allow for research into novel treatments for difficult to treat mental illnesses? Or does the law need to protect against the dangers of recreational use of this drug? You be the judge. Thanks for watching, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.